The next phase of the Cold War era is looking at how what historians refer to it as the Cold War heating up. So, the first question posed, how was the Cold War fought? It was fought through a number of different tactics, such as foreign aid, propaganda, espionage, brinkmanship, which was a term used mostly in the 50s and early 60s, multinational alliances, and then the surrogate wars, or sometimes we refer to those as the proxy wars or the hot wars. What were some of the examples of these tactics? So, we first mentioned foreign aid. And we've already looked at the Truman Doctrine, which offered up $300 million, and the Marshall Plan, which offered 12.5 billion, but only about 5 billion of that was used. In addition to that, we had the Mutual Defense Assistance Plan, which was $1.3 billion, the Agency for International Development, which was another $35 million, and the Mutual Security Act, which was $1 billion. So if you think of all those programs, that's a lot of money. And so the Cold War was very expensive, and the United States and the Soviet Union spent a lot of money fighting each other with these different tactics. In the view of the West, from the US perspective and those that allied with the US, the whole purpose, it was designed to help the Europeans fight communism. And they wanted to help Europe rebuild, which they do for the most part. Europe is able to recover by around 1955, by the early 60s. And they do try to stop the spread of communism in the Pacific and try to help countries in Africa as they gain their independence from former European nations. That's the whole decolonization process. So, propaganda continues after World War II. In a positive light, it can be through work, it can be through sports such as the Olympics, it can be done through education so that you could get ahead. So, they were constantly pushing their math and science programs. And then, negatively, there was always the threat of nuclear war and the invasion of spies or of countries. So I will post a video at the end of this called Bert the Turtle, which was an educational video that they showed in the schools to try to teach kids how to prepare for nuclear attacks. And I think when you watch it, first of all, you'll realize that it's definitely from like the 1950s and 60s, but the preparedness in the videos would in no way really protect anyone from a nuclear attack. As far as espionage goes, we had a number of new agencies that were added in addition to the FBI. So we had the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. I've already mentioned the FBI. We also had the National Security Agency and then the Defense Intelligence Agency. And since many of these groups were started, many more have been formed due to the modern age of terrorism. We also had a number of spy incidents that took place shortly after World War II. So we've got Alger Hiss and Donald Hiss, who were communist sympathizers. We had Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were communists. That was a huge scandal. The Rudolph Abel situation that ends up unfolding with the Francis Gary Powers situation. We looked at that yesterday in the Hot Wars presentation. And then Harry Gould and David Greenglass, which were communists. So the United States, the British, the Soviets, everyone was constantly concerned about spies. The US also brought about this idea of brinkmanship. So during the time period where Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and even a little bit of the Truman presidency, the US came up with this idea that we were always on the brink of possibly going to have a World War III or a nuclear war. And so evidence of this is shown through the Berlin airlift at the end of the 1940s, the Korean War, the Berlin crisis with the wall being built, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, all very tense situations where nuclear war was threatened. We also had a number of multinational alliances that formed. We've already discussed NATO and the Warsaw Pact, but each of those different multinational alliances that formed were all in the spirit of the Cold War and kind of putting these fronts up between the communist and the West, the democratic West. We've also discussed a number of the proxy wars or surrogate wars, also referred to as hot wars. So we've already covered the Greek Civil War and the Korean War and the Vietnam War. We're going to spend a little bit of time about a little bit of time on the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. I'm not going to cover this again. Had we been in school, I would have covered some of these events a little bit differently, but we've already talked about the events in Cuba. So I'm going to skip over that for now. So, what were some of the changes in Iran? So, after World War II, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is going to align with the West and some of the oil companies. And when he does this, most Iranians truly hated the West, but Pahlavi and Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, they decided to nationalize a lot of the British-owned oil companies around 1953. And so there was some tension that took place. The Shah fled. The United States gets involved, and they place the Shah back on the throne in Iran. They were afraid that Iran would go to the Soviet Union for aid if they did not get involved. And so through this process in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Shah of Iran did attempt to westernize and modernize Iran as much as possible. So they started to dress in more of a Western way. They did incorporate some popular Western practices, but they still culturally and religiously identified more with Middle Eastern practices. Most Iranians during this time period also still were very poor, where the Shah and some of his top officials lived a very wealthy life. Most Iranians struggled. And so by the time we get up into the 1970s, many of the traditional Iranians were quite frustrated. So there was a man by the name of the Ayatollah Khomeini who started to encourage Iranians to revolt in 1978. And when that started, the Shah decided to leave Iran. And so at the same time, he was also suffering from cancer. He came to the United States for cancer treatment. The Ayatollah Khomeini decided to set up a military style of government and more of a theocracy where the government and the state were interwoven. And so the Shah could not return to Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted the Shah to be returned, but that did not happen. In 1979, some of the revolutionaries then seized the U.S. Embassy and they took 60 Americans hostage and held them for over a year, 444 days. They were actually released in 1981 after President Reagan was inaugurated. And so this was kind of a scandal that took place during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. There were a few Americans that were able to escape the embassy attack, and they hid out in the Canadian embassy's home. And so that is depicted in the movie Argo. So I'll put a trailer for that at the end of this presentation. We also have the famous Iran-Iraqi war. War is going to break out because the Ayatollah Khomeini started to encourage other Muslims to overthrow their secular leaders. And so this led to some imbalance in the Middle East. And this is kind of a unique situation here, but the United States actually funded both sides in this war, which sounds kind of odd, but there was a lot of slick dealings taking place. The Soviet Union funded Iraq in this dispute. And then the war eventually ends in 1988. It just lagged on through the 80s, but there was finally a United Nations ceasefire. And unfortunately, millions of Iraqi and Iranian civilians died during the Iran-Iraqi war. So, finally getting back to Afghanistan, how was the Cold War tested in Afghanistan? So, by around 1979, the Afghan people wanted independence, But the Soviets didn't want to give up their control of Afghanistan. So they invaded Afghanistan because the Muslims revolted and threatened to bring down the communist regime. The U.S. supplies the Afghan rebels during this time period, the Mujahideen. President Carter warned the Soviets about attempting to gain control of the Persian Gulf. That's where a lot of people started to get really worried and concerned because of all the oil in the Persian Gulf. And so there are all these protests about the invasion. They said they were going to stop grain shipments to the Soviet Union. While President Carter was in office, the United States boycotts the 1980 Moscow Olympics. And then the premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, finally withdraws troops in 1989. You could kind of equate the war in Afghanistan for the Soviet Union. It was kind of similar to the Vietnam War for the United States. Lots of money spent, a lot of lives lost, and they really didn't get much out of it. A lot of the Afghanistan tensions are depicted in a famous movie called Charlie Wilson's War. So I will put a clip of that trailer at the end of this presentation also, as we would have watched that in class. This is a very famous picture. Some of you may have seen this before. This is of an Afghan refugee that was found in a Pakistan refugee camp. And in this picture, she's only 12 years old. And for many years, no one knew who this girl was. People started writing into National Geographic, wondering, did she survive? And then finally, 17 years later, they find her. So this is Shabat Gula. She is pictured here at around 29 years old, a little bit around that age. And she did live a very difficult life. She did end up getting married somewhere between the ages of 13 and 16, had a number of children. And then this is a picture of her right or within the last year, around age 47. So she did move around to a number of different refugee camps. Eventually, she was sponsored so that she could go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. So her family was sponsored for that. But it just kind of shows you how difficult her life was as you look at the change in those pictures.